So I think this model of the arm muscles is going to be very helpful for you because it's going to require that you think about the orientation of these muscles relative to each other, because hopefully you'll notice that it is not in anatomical position. It is in a kind of half pronated position, almost as though you were reaching out and tilting your hand so that your palm is in a vertical position as if you were shaking somebody's hand. So for example, in this model of the bones that I have right here, this model is actually in anatomical position. So we have the anterior part of the upper arm and then the anterior part of the forearm and palm as well. But notice that that doesn't match what the model of the muscles is doing. The model of the muscles is actually in that type of position. So you can see how I haven't changed the position of the upper arm at all, but I have kind of half pronated that forearm. So just keep that orientation in mind as you are looking at these muscles. We're going to divide our upper limb muscles on this model into a few different groups. We're not really going to be able to talk about ones that are coming from the axial skeleton to the pectoral girdle because we don't have the axial skeleton to view. But we are going to talk about some of the muscles that are going from the pectoral girdle to the humerus, muscles of the anterior upper arm, muscles of the posterior upper arm, and then muscles of the forearm. Before we start identifying the muscles that originate on the pectoral girdle and insert into the humerus, might help for us to actually identify parts of the pectoral girdle that we can see on this model. So this right here is the lateral surface of the shoulder, of the right shoulder. So let's go ahead and turn this around a little bit so we can get a better view of the anterior perspective. And what we should expect to see on the anterior side is the clavicle, and you can indeed see that here. So here we have our sternal end of the clavicle, our curvature to it, and then here you can see the hook of the acromial end of the clavicle as well. And then you can see just posterior to that, a little bit posterior to that is where the acromion of the scapula is going to be. And then if we continue to follow that part of the scapula, we should be able to see the scapular spine. So this is identifying the posterior part and where the spine is going to be. So that should tell us then that this is going to be the medial border. And see approximately where that inferior angle is going to be. So this then gives you another view of that clavicle as well. And then last but not least, although it may be a little difficult to see, you should be able to identify that this is also the coracoid process of the scapula, because recall that that hooks more anterior than the acromion of the scapula. So there you go. Those are the pectoral girdle components, at least the components of the scapula and the clavicle that we can see on this model, even though the muscles are there. So as for the muscles themselves, we are going to be dividing these up into the rotator cuff muscles, the various components of the deltoid, and then the teres major. So let's go ahead and actually start with the deltoid, because if you were looking at this model, you might be able to identify this deltoid muscle just based on your general knowledge of human muscles. The deltoid muscle kind of acts as a shoulder cap, and it can be visible on three different sides of the body. So we have the posterior component of the deltoid, the lateral component, and then the anterior component as well. All three of those have the exact same insertion. All of them are going to insert into the deltoid tuberosity of the humerus, which hopefully you recall. However, those three different regions have three different origins and therefore three different actions as well. So if we're looking at this anterior part, you can probably tell even just by looking at that it is coming from the parts of the clavicle and the acromion. So these are the anterior fibers, and because those are located on the anterior part of the body, those are going to be able to contribute to the flexion of the shoulder. So when this muscle contracts, the arm is going to flex. The lateral fibers are coming from the acromion of the scapula, and because of the lateral orientation of those are going to help to abduct the shoulder. And then last but not least, we have the posterior fibers. And the posterior fibers, again, if you just look at it, because you can see the bone, they're coming from the spine, primarily from the spine of the scapula. But again, still with that same insertion. So these are muscles that are going to be able to help extend the shoulder. So it's an interesting muscle. It's one of the few muscles that has 3 actions associated with it. Let's go ahead and remove that muscle now from the model so we can get a better view of what is going to be underneath it. Now that we've removed that muscle, we can get a better view of that scapular spine and acromion, but now we can also see much more clearly where the humerus is going to be. In terms of these rotator cuff muscles, we can think about them in several different groups. First of all, just because they're called the rotator cuff muscles doesn't mean that they all actually rotate. Only 3 of them are involved in either shoulder medial rotation or lateral rotation. 3 of the 4 of them are also just simply and conveniently named for the fossa of the scapula that they originate from. So if you already know your bony markings well, that should help you out with these identifications. 3 of them are primarily visible from the posterior side, while 1 of them is mainly visible on the anterior side. And finally, 3 of them are going to insert into the greater tubercle of the humerus, while only 1 of them is going to insert into the lesser tubercle. So in each case, you've got a 3-to-1 ratio in those features, but it's not necessarily the same that are always in the 3 versus the 1. When it comes to at least the insertion points, if you think about it, the greater tubercle is larger, therefore it accommodates the majority of the rotator cuff insertions. What's the majority of 4? 3. So 3 of them insert into the greater and 1 into the lesser. So let's go ahead and start with those posterior ones. So here we have, again, that spine of the scapula, and if you recall from our scapula, the fossa that is above the spine was the supraspinous fossa, and below the spine was the infraspinous fossa. The muscle that we can see here in the superior part of the spine, or just superior to the spine, in that supraspinous fossa is the supraspinatus. The muscle right below that, below the spine, is the infraspinatus, and so each one of those is named after the fossa that it happens to occupy. And both of those muscles are going to be inserting into the greater tubercle. However, you can tell that they have very different orientations. So this muscle, this is the very large infraspinatus. Now it looks kind of like 3 subsets of fibers on this specific model, but all of these are part of the same muscle. Those have a very lateral orientation. So it probably doesn't surprise you that when this muscle is contracting, it's going to laterally rotate the shoulder. However, this smaller supraspinatus up on top also has more of a lateral orientation, but it's in a superior position as opposed to a posterior position. So when this muscle contracts, it is going to abduct the shoulder. And each one of those only has that one action. The other muscle that we can see here from the rotator cuff group that is present on the posterior side is this one right here, and that is the teres minor. The teres means round, and minor is small. I will give you a preview that this is the teres minor, this is the teres major. You can probably see small and big, minor and major. The minor is one of the rotator cuff muscles, and so notice how it is also inserting into that greater tubercle. While that infraspinatus muscle is originating from that infraspinous fossa, the teres minor, although you can't really see all of it, it's actually coming from that lateral border of the scapula. And so we can't see the lateral border because it's kind of down under here. It's down under those muscles, but that's where that muscle is originating from. Because its fibers are fairly parallel to that infraspinatus, you can probably assume that, or you should probably be able to deduce that it is also going to be responsible for laterally rotating the shoulder joint. So our first 3 rotator cuff muscles again. Teres minor laterally rotates, infraspinatus laterally rotates, supraspinatus abducts the arm. Let's move over to the anterior side. And we can see here on this side that we only have one large muscle on the anterior side of the scapula. That is originating from the subscapular fossa, and that is the subscapularis. This is the only one that inserts into the lesser tubercle, and it is the only one that medially rotates. So anterior side, lesser tubercle insertion, medial rotator, which is different than the posterior side ones that at least 2 of the 3 are lateral rotators. So those are the rotator cuff muscles. And then the last muscle that I want to point out that's originating from the pectoral girdle is that teres major that we were just mentioning. This muscle is going to be originating from the inferior angle of the scapula, which you can better see from this anterior view. The teres major is going to insert into the crest of the lesser tubercle. I want to briefly revisit our model of the humerus in order to point out some of these insertions a little bit better, because it might help you identify the muscles on the model when you can see these points of insertions relative to each other. So recall again that this is the greater tubercle, and then this is going to be the lesser tubercle. The more medial one and more anterior, and then the more lateral one and the larger one. And in between them, we had that intertubercular sulcus. I want you to think about this sulcus as being almost analogous to a half pipe that skateboarders or snowboarders might perform on. And at the edge of each of the half pipe, you're going to find a ridge, the topmost part. And notice how that ridge is essentially continuous with the tubercle. So this is the lesser tubercle, and this is the crest of the half pipe. This is the crest of the lesser tubercle. And then on the other side, this is the greater tubercle, continuous with that, and that is the crest of the greater tubercle. And so that intertubercular sulcus is actually in between the 2 crests. Okay, so let's now go back to our muscle model and look for those features. So you should be able to notice here on this bone that here is our greater tubercle where we said all those rotator cuff muscles were inserting. Here is that intertubercular sulcus. So that is the tendon of that biceps brachii long head that we mentioned, that whose tendon sits there in that sulcus. And then this is the lesser tubercle. So right here, if we were to follow that greater tubercle, this is where that crest of the greater tubercle is going to be. And you can see that there's a muscle that inserts there. And it's this large muscle here that is also originating from part of the pectoral girdle, coming from the clavicle, specifically that medial part of the clavicle. That's the pectoralis major. This is a much larger muscle than what you can actually see on this model, but this is a portion of it. The pectoralis major is also going to be originating not only from the clavicle, but also from the sternum and some of the costal cartilages, specifically from ribs 2 through 6. So it's a very large muscle. It has 3 points of origin. It also has 3 actions. So that's one that's going to be inserting into that crest of the greater tubercle. Let's now move on to the muscles of the anterior forearm. We're just going to consider these by this region instead, because among these muscles we're going to see examples of originating on the pectoral girdle and inserting on the humerus, originating on the pectoral girdle and inserting into the radius, and originating on the humerus and inserting into into the ulna. So we've got a little bit of variation here, and that should also tell you we're going to see some variability in what the actions are based on what joints they're crossing. So the most superficial ones, and probably the ones that you casually associate most with the anterior upper arm, are the biceps muscles. So just as we had biceps femoris muscles in the lower limb, we have biceps brachii muscles here. Biceps, so that should tell us that there are 2 heads, 2 origins. One is the biceps brachii long head, and one is the short head. We've already mentioned previously that the tendon of the biceps brachii long head is going to sit in that intertubercular sulcus. And ultimately that is going to be originating from that supraglenoid tubercle of the glenoid cavity. So again, just as a little bit of a reminder for you there. So let's take a quick peek at our scapula, though just keep in mind this is a left scapula and a right arm. But here is that glenoid cavity, and we had the supraglenoid tubercle at 12 o'clock and the infraglenoid tubercle at 6 o'clock. Both of these are going to be origins for long head muscles, so just keep that in mind. Right now we're talking about the biceps brachii long head. So this is the one that is going to 12 o'clock. So if we follow that around, that is going to be the more lateral of the biceps muscles. So this is the biceps brachii long head. We can see the division right in between those two muscles. And then notice how the more medial belly of those muscles has a different tendon showing the origin. Here we can see and follow this tendon, and it's coming to this hooked process, which is the coracoid process of the scapula. So the origin of the short head is the coracoid process, the origin of the long head is the supraglenoid tubercle, and both of them together are going to insert into the radial tuberosity via this biceps tendon. If you were to go right now and put your arm out, straighten it out, extend your elbow, and then slightly flex your elbow and feel right at this region with your fingers, you should be able to feel this tendon sticking up. You should feel something kind of hard and tough right underneath the skin. That's not a bone you're feeling, that's actually that biceps tendon. Let's go back now to that coracoid process that we were just talking about. And we can see how the coracoid process also has another tendon originating there that is then traveling down right underneath the biceps brachii short head. That is the coracobrachialis. So it's the one that originates on the coracoid process, and then it's located here in the brachial region. This is a relatively small muscle compared to the others of this region. However, it does have multiple actions. It's responsible for flexing the shoulder, and then also adducting the shoulder joint, so bringing it back towards the body line. The biceps brachii short head is responsible for flexing the elbow and supinating, and then the long head is going to help flex the elbow and also supinate. And then last but not least, is going to be this muscle right here that sits underneath the biceps brachii long head. You'll notice how this muscle originates on the humerus itself, kind of the distal anterior part of the humerus. This is the brachialis muscle. This is actually the largest muscle of the upper arm. Most people think about their biceps as being the big flexors, but this one actually contributes more to the force of elbow flexion than the biceps do themselves. And this one is going to insert into the ulnar tuberosity in addition to the coronoid process of the ulna. So we have a brachialis that's inserting into parts of the ulna, and the biceps brachii that are inserting into the radius. So all of these, all three of these, the biceps and the brachialis, those are all going to be elbow flexors. But the coracobrachialis is not going to have any effect on the elbow because it inserts into the medial humerus. So it can't do anything to the elbow because it doesn't actually cross the elbow. And next, the posterior region of the upper arm. This is where you're going to find the three triceps muscles. Triceps, three heads. So this is actually three muscles, unlike the biceps. And these are named not only based on the length of the origin, but also based on their relative positions. So superficially, if we're looking at that posterior region, we can actually see two muscles. This is one of them. You can see all of these muscle fibers going in that direction. And then here's the second. Again, you can see the muscle fibers in a second direction. But again, they share the same tendon because they'll have the same point of insertion. This one right here, remember before that I mentioned to use as a landmark this tendon that splits the teres minor and the teres major. And this is going to be the tendon of the triceps brachii long head. This is the tendon that is going to ultimately go up to that infraglenoid tubercle at 6 o'clock on that glenoid cavity. So the triceps brachii long head comes from the infraglenoid tubercle. The biceps brachii long head originates at the supraglenoid tubercle. So both long heads are coming from there. This one is not the short head. There is no triceps brachii short head. This is the lateral head. So we can see how this one is definitely the more lateral region. This is probably about as lateral on the arm as you can get. So the triceps brachii lateral head is going to be originating from the middle part of the posterior humerus, and we can see that origin right there. So this is one that is originating on the humerus itself. And then finally, if we head more medially, we're going to be able to see this muscle right there. That is the triceps brachii medial head. So we have a long head, a medial head, and the lateral head. All of them share this same tendon, and that triceps tendon is going to insert into the olecranon of the ulna. So they all have the same insertion. They also all have the same action. These are the 3 elbow extenders. The last muscle that I wanted to mention is still located on this posterior side and almost divides the upper arm from the forearm. And that is this little muscle right here that is just lateral to those biceps and just lateral to the olecranon of the ulna. And that is the anconeus muscle. This is the other elbow extender. So the triceps extend the elbow, but this one does contribute to that motion as well. This also inserts into the olecranon of the ulna, so it shares that same insertion. However, it's originating from the lateral epicondyle of the humerus. So those are all of our posterior extenders, the 3 triceps muscles, and the anconeus. So when it comes to the muscles nomenclature, in the forearm, more than almost any other part of the body we've looked at thus far, the name of the muscle really reflects its action, which is really reflective of its location. And so I want you to be thinking about all of that together, because if you know the name of the muscle, the name often tells you a lot about its action, and it also tells you then about where its location is going to be. So again, that's why it's so important to learn all of this information and integrate it rather than just memorizing tables or note cards of muscle information. So let's go ahead and look at this forearm for a second, just to give you an example. This is the anterior side of the arm that we can see here. And on the anterior side of the arm, we would expect to find muscles that are going to be responsible for flexing the wrist. And so I want to refer to that consistently here as basically the flexor side of the arm. So when I'm talking about the flexor side of the forearm, I'm specifically talking about the anterior side of the arm. On the other hand, that posterior side, this is the side of the arm that is going to be responsible for extending the wrist. So this posterior side is the extensor side of the arm. So we have a flexor side, and then we have an extensor side. But the other actions that we're going to see here in the wrist are going to allow for either the abduction or the adduction. Now keep in mind, remember our thumb here is on the lateral side, and this is on the medial side. So if the wrist is moving towards the mid-body line, it would go this direction, and that would be adduction, ADD, adduction. Well, this would be abduction, abducting something, taking it away. So a muscle responsible for adducting would have to be found on that medial side of the arm. Which bone is on the medial side? The ulna. So if a muscle has the ulna in its name somewhere, it is probably going to be a muscle that is responsible for adduction. On the other hand, a muscle that would be responsible for abducting the wrist would have to be located on the radial side. So it would have the name radialis in its name. So keep that in mind. And think about the fact that when we're looking at these muscles, if they are on the anterior side, on the flexor side, they usually have the name flexor in them. If they're on the posterior side, they often have the name extensor in them. And then if they are on the radial side, they would be an abductor and have radialis in their name. If they are on the medial side, that's the ulnar side, and they would be an adductor and tend to have ulnaris in their name. So now let's go ahead and look at these actual muscles and where they're located. We're going to begin by focusing on the anterior side of the forearm, or the flexor side of the arm, as we were referring to just a bit ago. This is also the palmar side of the hand. All of these muscles that we're going to look at in this region are going to originate from one of the 2 epicondyles of the humerus, or at least they will include that epicondyle as one of their origins if they have multiple. Most of these muscles that we're going to see on this anterior part originate right over here at the medial epicondyle. So as we go around the arm, almost as if you had a band around your arm, and we're going to follow it all the way around and back to the beginning. To help identify these muscles, I want you to think about two rules, okay? I want you to think about finding your landmarks that I'm going to point out to you, which are not necessarily muscles, but help to point out key distinctions between muscles, and then also follow the tendon. Follow the tendon, like follow the yellow brick road, okay? Follow the tendon of that muscle to see where it is going, where it's inserting, where it's coming from, because that will often give you a lot more information than just looking at the location of the bellies. Because as you can imagine, in this region right here, if I was just to just eliminate all of the rest of the arm and just show you those muscles, you could probably agree that they don't look a whole lot different from each other, okay? It's only once you get the big picture. So don't get that tunnel vision. Make sure you're looking at the entire muscle, which includes the tendon of that muscle. So we're gonna go ahead and start here. And I'm gonna introduce you to landmark number one, which is that structure right there. That is our biceps tendon. So recall, here's our biceps brachii, and the biceps brachii is the tendon is going to cross the elbow and then insert into that radial tuberosity. And notice how that tendon comes right in the middle and kind of separates this entire group of muscles from that muscle right there. So if we are looking down that center part of our forearm, we've got a chunk of several muscles, and then there's one big muscle on the thumb side there, on that radial side. So looking at that, we're going to start right here. And from that epicondyle, I want you to notice and pay attention to four muscles. We've got 1, 2, 3, and 4. There's a little bit of a muscle peeking out here between number 3 and number 4, but I want you to ignore that one for right now. So 1, 2, 3, and 4. We use the mnemonic PF, PF for this. Some people say pass, fail, pass, fail. I want you to pass all of your exams, not only half of them, but that's kind of one of the tricks people use for these four muscles. So PF, PF. P, the first P, that is going to be the pronator teres. This is a muscle that is originating from that medial epicondyle, but it's not going to go very far down the arm. It's only going to insert into the lateral surface of the radius. So it's not even going to get down to the wrist, so it's not going to do anything to the wrist. The only thing this is going to do is based on that location. You can probably guess that it's anterior, it crosses the elbow, so it is probably flexing the elbow, and that is true. And also think of its name, pronator teres. We've already said that teres means rounded muscle. What is pronator? Pronator is implying that it is a pronator of the arm. So that is a muscle that is not only flexing the elbow, but also pronating the forearm. So that's the first P. So PF. This is the next F here. And as you might be able to guess, the F stands for flexor. We're on that flexor side here. So this is the flexor muscle. It's a muscle that flexes the wrist, so therefore it is a flexor carpi muscle. Recall that carpi means wrist. But there's a third name to this, or third word in this muscle's name. It is the flexor carpi radialis. So this is going, and this muscle, this flexor carpi radialis, its tendon is going to go and actually insert into the palmar surface of metacarpals 2 and 3. You can't see it because it disappears right there, but we're on this radial side, which means that because it's not right in the middle, it's off to one side or the other. It's on that radial side, that lateral side. Not only is this muscle going to flex the wrist, flexor carpi, but because it's a radialis muscle, it is also going to be responsible for abducting the wrist, abducting the hand. So flexor carpi radialis flexes the wrist, abducts the hand. PF, pronator teres, flexor carpi radialis. Now our next P is the palmaris longus. Palmaris longus, this one you can see has a very long tendon. Here goes the tendon, keeps going, keeps going, keeps going, and then all the way out here and ultimately inserting into the palmar aponeurosis, which has been removed on this model, so you can't specifically see it. This is one that muscle that is only responsible for flexing the wrist. It's right down the middle. It's not on the ulnar or the radial side, so it's not going to abduct or adduct. It's only going to be responsible for that wrist flexion. PF, pronator teres, flexor carpi radialis, palmaris longus, flexor carpi ulnaris. So this one, we've got this muscle coming on down, and it is going to cross the wrist because it's a flexor carpi muscle, but it is on the ulnar side as well. So instead of inserting into the palmar surface of metacarpals 2 and 3 like the radialis did, this one is going to be inserting into the palmar surface of metacarpal number 5, as well as the pisiform and the hamate. So we're sticking to that ulnar side. So not only is this muscle able to flex the arm, or flex the wrist, but it is also going to be able to adduct the hand. So if it's an ulnaris, it adducts. If it's a radialis, it abducts. So there you go. That's your PF. Now, I mentioned that there was that other little muscle kind of peeking underneath there. That muscle right there is the, because notice that we haven't talked about any muscles yet that actually move the digits themselves, because all of these muscles either have tendons that are inserting into carpal bones, metacarpals, or the palmar aponeurosis. Underneath here, this little muscle that you see peeking through there, which is also the same as this muscle that is just underneath these tendons, that is the flexor digitorum superficialis. Let's go ahead and remove this, and you can get a better view of this muscle. It's a very wide muscle and a very flat muscle, and this muscle is actually going to go all the way down to the palmar surfaces of the middle phalanges of digits 2, 3, 4, and 5, all the way at those proximal phalanges. So that's the flexor digitorum superficialis. So that takes care of all of those muscles that are here on the flexor side. I'm going to put this back on here now. We'll take a peek at that afterwards. So as we're moving around, again, just as a quick review, we had initially landmark number 1, biceps tendon, followed by PF, pronator teres, flexor carpi radialis, palmaris longus, flexor carpi ulnaris. And now we get to landmark number 2 as we're moving on to this side of the arm. So as we came around, you could see we had that flexor carpi ulnaris, and then if we're up here at the elbow region, at this proximal region, we can see the olecranon and the triceps tendon that's going to be right here, in addition to this little muscle right here. This is the anconeus. We'll come back to that, but I want you to notice that that's kind of part of this whole landmark. And all of this line is dividing these two muscle bellies. If we look more at the distal region of this forearm, we can see that now, once we start to see a separation, there's actually a bone right here. As you can probably guess, that's actually the ulna. So you can see a separation between these two muscles distally. The bellies are right up against each other in the middle, and then there's a separation proximally as well. As you can probably guess, if this was the flexor carpi ulnaris, this is going to be the extensor carpi ulnaris. I'm going to go ahead and rotate this arm around a bit so we can get a better view just based on the way that it rests on the table here. But so we can better see some of these extensor muscles here. There we go, that should work for us. Okay, so all of these extensor muscles that we're going to be talking about next, or this whole next group of muscles, are all going to be originating from the lateral epicondyle of the humerus. And we can't completely see that lateral epicondyle. It's kind of hiding underneath this region right there. But we can still see that landmark we were talking about a minute ago here with that triceps tendon. And then here's that anconeus muscle. So this is, again, is our extensor carpi ulnaris. So we've got on either side of the bone here, flexor carpi ulnaris, extensor carpi ulnaris. And that extensor carpi ulnaris is going to insert, as you can see, onto the dorsal surface of metacarpal 5, as opposed to the palmar surface, which is where the flexor carpi ulnaris was inserting. So let's go ahead and keep moving around. If you recall, on the other side, in between we had some muscles in between the radialis muscles and the ulnaris muscle that were responsible for just moving the wrist. They weren't doing any abduction or adduction, and we have the same thing here, but this time we have two muscles. We have this muscle right here and this muscle right here. So again, extensor carpi ulnaris, and then these two extensor muscles as well. Let's go ahead and follow these tendons, just as we were saying before. This one right here, if we follow this tendon, we can see that it goes underneath the extensor retinaculum, and then notice how it only goes out here to digit number 5. When this other one comes down underneath the retinaculum, you can already see it starting to divide here, and then it splits. It goes out to digit 2, it goes to 3, it goes to 4, and some of it splits and goes to 5 as well. So this muscle is going to extend all of the digits except for the thumb. This is the extensor digitorum. This muscle is only going to be responsible for extending the little finger. As a way to help you remember that one, this is the extensor digiti minimi. I want you to think about the movie Austin Powers, if you happen to have seen it, and Dr. Evil, and think about the Dr. Evil pose. What muscle is doing that, extending that pinky like that? The extensor digiti minimi. Who was the character that Dr. Evil created in this movie? His mini-me. So the Dr. Evil pose is done by and facilitated by the extensor digiti minimi. So again, on extensor side here, extensor carpi ulnaris, extensor digiti minimi, extensor digitorum, and now we're going to get to our third landmark. And our third landmark is actually some muscles that you don't need to know. If you look right here, so this was that extensor digitorum, now we reach these two muscles that kind of wrap off in a completely different direction than anything we've been looking at so far. You don't need to know these muscles, but these are two muscles that help with extending and adducting the thumb. So, and you can probably see that even by following their tendon. Just know those as the thumb muscles for right now. Because one thing I want you to notice is that while up over here, we get to these the bellies of these muscles up over here, but their tendons are wrapped by those thumb muscles. So if we're following up approximately at the forearm, we're following the bellies, but if we're following around at the tendons, we're going to hit that landmark before we get to these tendons. All three of these muscles, 1, 2, and 3, all have the name radialis in them. So all of these three radialis muscles here are wrapped by the thumb muscles. So that's landmark number 3. Just as we had an extensor carpi ulnaris, now we also need on this side extensor carpi radialises, but there are actually two. We have an extensor carpi radialis brevis and an extensor carpi radialis longus. And you may remember that when we have longus or brevis attached to a muscle, it's referencing the length of a tendon in one direction or another. So this extensor carpi radialis, you can see how up over in this region, we're still pretty much looking at a muscle belly, but look how the tendon of this longus has already started. So this one has the really long tendon, while this one has the really short tendon. But this extensor carpi radialis is going to continue down. Its tendon is going to go underneath the two thumb muscles. We can see it appear right here. And then eventually it is going to go and insert into the dorsal surface of metacarpal 3. While this extensor carpi radialis longus is continuing down, its tendon is also going to go underneath the thumb muscles, but it is going to insert into the dorsal surface of metacarpal number 2. So those are the two extensor carpi radialis muscles. Then what's this last one? The last muscle on our way around that is also coming from that lateral epicondyle of the humerus, that is the brachioradialis. Radialis is applying, it's on the radial side, but do you notice it does not have flexor and it does not have extensor in its name? And that's because it does not do anything to the wrist. Let's follow that around a little bit. This is the muscle. You can see it's actually quite large. The belly of it is quite big. On your forearm, again, that biceps tendon is going right down the middle. On one side of your forearm, on that medial side of your forearm, it's several muscle bellies that make up that side of your forearm, your anterior forearm. This is pretty much this one muscle here. It's a very large muscle relative to the other forearm muscles, and this is the brachioradialis. It is actually going to insert, if we were to kind of follow it a little bit, we can't completely see where it goes because it's underneath this region here, because it's going to insert into the styloid process of the radius. So think about that. It does not cross the wrist. However, it is coming again from that lateral epicondyle. So what joint does it cross? It crosses the elbow. It's on the anterior side. What do you think it's going to do to the elbow? It is going to flex the elbow. The very last muscle I want to point out is one that is deep to all of these radialis muscles, and that is this muscle right here. It's pretty wide. It's quite flat. And you might be able to see that the muscle fibers are even on a bit of an angle right here. This is the supinator muscle. So this is a deep muscle here. And this is a muscle that originates on that lateral epicondyle along with part of the proximal ulna, but it's actually going to insert into the proximal part of the radius. So what joint is it crossing? The only joint it's crossing is actually the radio-ulnar joint. So this is one that is responsible and helping with that process of supination, hence the name, the supinator. So what I want you to think, I'm going to kind of try to put this arm here in about the same orientation as this arm. And so think about where that supinator muscle would be located. And if that muscle were to contract, essentially it's going to cause the arm to cross like that. We're going to see this supination occurring. And so that's what that small muscle is going to be doing in that region. All right, one final review of these forearm muscles. And this is what I want you to practice doing at home. Go ahead and hold your forearm in front of you, just like this image is showing you right now. And I want you to go ahead and feel for that biceps tendon. Flex your elbow just a little bit and you should be able to feel this tendon sticking out. And now put your hand up along that medial epicondyle like you can see in the picture, because that's going to help get you started on where those first set of muscles are. And let's go ahead and work our way all the way around the arm, pointing out our landmarks and then the muscles that are associated with them. So we've got our biceps tendon. Now we have our PFPF, pronator teres, flexor carpi radialis, palmaris longus, flexor carpi ulnaris. And then we can see parts of the flexor digitorum superficialis underneath all of those tendons. Landmark number 2, either the triceps tendon / anconeus or the ulna itself. So now we have the extensor carpi ulnaris, extensor digiti minimi, extensor digitorum. Landmark number 3, thumb muscles, extensor carpi radialis brevis, extensor carpi radialis longus, brachioradialis, and now we're all the way back to the biceps tendon. So there you go. That's your tour of the forearm. I want you to practice going through that route just on your own arm, doing it on your right and your left arm, and starting laterally and then starting medially in each direction.